All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I apologize right off the bat for my voice. You can tell I'm under the weather tonight. So we'll see how long my voice holds out, but I don't have a whole lot of hope for it. So I do apologize, but we have a limited number of meetings, and so I want to make sure that we don't cancel a meeting unless it's absolutely necessary. So we will soldier on and see how it goes tonight. But welcome back. Um, Tonight, our topic is going to be mission statements and goals and the impact of goals on the effectiveness of organizations. Before we get to that point, though, just as a reminder, coming up then on Sunday, you have a couple of things that are due. You have your next Canvas essay. That Canvas essay is going to look at the mission statement of your organization and identification of two goals of your organization, and then how the problem that you are using as the topic for your assignments in the class, how that problem is impacting or affecting the achievement of those goals. So you got that Canvas essay as normal. Then you also have your alternative solutions paper that is coming up. And for the alternative solutions paper, just as a reminder, as I have on the screen, you're going to be presenting 3 alternative solutions. And then for each one of those alternative solutions, you'll tell me what the solution is and how that solution could solve or could mitigate the problem in the organization to address the issue, what specific steps will be taken in that alternative solution. You'll tell me about the actors involved in that solution, who's involved in the development and implementation of the solution, what roles each individual or group will play, and how would you get the agreement or the buy-in of each one of those actors. And then finally, how easy or difficult would it be to actually implement the solution? So for each of your 3 alternative solutions, you're going to be identifying the alternative, talking about the actors involved, and then the ease or difficulty of implementation. This can be a very short paper. You don't have to add just to make it longer. I know in the instructions it says no more than 10 pages. Typically, they're a lot shorter than 10 pages. You may be able to handle each solution in 1 page each. So you may be 3 or 4 pages. But whatever you need in order to do the paper is certainly going to be good enough. I'm not going to be looking at the quantity. I'm looking at the quality. So just the title page, then those 3 aspects of each one of your alternative solutions, and then a reference sheet if you are using any external references. So that's your alternative solutions paper. Any questions about the alternative solutions paper?
Yes, I have a question, Dr. Powell. Just to make sure we don't have to use references, correct? But we can if we would like to.
Exactly. Yeah, that's correct. You're not required to, but if it would be beneficial. So, for instance, if this is a alternative solution that's been used somewhere else and there's actually some literature on it, feel free to incorporate that, but you're not required to have any outside resources.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions on the alternative solutions paper? All right, let me go ahead and stop that share, and let's share out our slides for tonight, and we'll see how things go. Thanks for the well wishes. I hopefully coming up to the tail end of it. We'll see. It's been about 3 days now, so I guess when you're not out and about and you're not exposed to a whole lot of different bugs, I guess when you finally do get something, it kind of hits you a little bit harder than it normally would if you had that immune system built up. It is not COVID. I've tested twice, and so I still have not had COVID throughout the entire pandemic. And I guess I always tell my wife it's super immunity. So I guess my super immunity is still alive and well. I just have some garden variety virus or cold. So we'll see how we do tonight. Yes, I'm overdue for my flu shot. I actually just got my shingles shot because I'm over 50, and that was something else. I'll tell you, I usually have no reactions whatsoever to any types of vaccinations. I had, my 2 COVID vaccines and my 2 boosters and felt absolutely nothing. And then I had the shingles vaccine and I really, really did feel it. So, I don't know, it was interesting, but I had that a couple of weeks ago. So I think I'm out of the woods with that one. I think this is just kind of something separate that just hit me. So let's talk about our topic for tonight. And again, what I'll do is I don't have a whole lot to say about goals. I know that you've covered goals, you've covered strategic planning at different aspects of the program so far. So I don't have a whole lot on it, but we'll discuss it for a little bit, and then we'll do some breakout groups and reconvene as a class and see what we came up with. And then we'll reassess in terms of time. And if my voice is still holding out, we have time, we might work ahead a little bit with some effectiveness models, some information from next week. If not, then we'll just cut it short and just talk about that next week. But for tonight, let me go ahead and get this started. So for tonight, we're talking about goals and objectives, strategic planning, mission statements, and the impacts that these goals and objectives and mission statements have on the effectiveness of an organization. And again, you've talked about strategic planning before in the program. You've probably participated in strategic planning as well in your organization. So a lot of you probably have some good practical experience with strategic planning, the development of goals and development of action plans for the achievement of those goals. So a lot of this information you've already been exposed to and you have some practical experience with. But we know that there are different types of goals. Your official goals are those goals that you typically tend to see in mission statements, annual reports. You see those in strategic plans. These are the goals that are articulated by the organization. These are oftentimes those long-term, long-range goals that really give voice to the purpose of the organization, why the organization is around, and relate back directly to the mission of that organization. Nice thing about official goals is that they really do add some legitimacy to the organization. So not only people within the organization, but people in the external environment know what the organization is all about, know why the organization exists, that it has a reason for its existence. And we know when we look at bureaucracies, especially at the federal level, it is sometimes difficult to get rid of agencies. That once agencies are created, agencies tend to hang around because agencies are very good at furthering their survival by picking up additional functions and picking up the support from additional client and constituent groups. And so even when an agency may outlive its usefulness, it's still around and it still hangs around for decades just because it's able to go out there and find a different turf, if you will, that it's able to gain access to help its survival. We talked about in our discussion of different organization theories, we talked about systems theory and how you import energy from your environment in order to survive. And a lot of organizations become very good at that. And so they kind of find other things to do and find other purposes. But if we have a very well-defined set of goals for our organization, we have a purpose for the organization, then the organization has that legitimacy both inside the walls of the organization as well as out in the external environment. And we also know that official goals are very good at guiding and motivating employee behavior. So we have something we can work toward as employees within the organization. But official goals are the ones that are well articulated by the organization. They tend to be the longer term type of purposeful types of goals. Operative goals are those relatively specific intermediate goals that will hopefully help us build toward our official goals. And I don't know if you've been exposed to Robert Ben yet in the program, but it's Robert Ben, B-E-H-N. And Robert Ben has an interesting theory, has a kind of unfortunate title, but it's an interesting theory. And he refers to it as the management by groping along. And he says that organizations oftentimes are not able to focus on their official goals, their long-term goals. So instead, they focus on their intermediate goals. And so they kind of have success, very limited success in terms of achieving their intermediate goals as they grope along toward the eventual achievement of their official long-term goals. But those are operative goals, the ones that are intermediate in nature that hopefully will allow you to achieve your overall goal. The nice thing, obviously, about operative goals is they help us build some momentum. So if you've got an official goal that may take 5 or 10 or 15 years to achieve, if you have some operative goals, those operative goals can then help you obviously have some achievements and some accomplishments along the way to motivate employees and to kind of build that momentum toward achieving that long-term goal. Now, we know when we're talking about goals that there's a lot of literature in public administration that looks at the effectiveness of goals. And we know that goals can really do some good things for organizations, that organizations that have goals can use those goals to orient employees toward the mission of the organization. We're oftentimes in our organizations looking for organizational harmony. And organizational harmony often comes from goal congruence, where we can have this congruence, we have this meeting of the organization's goals and individual employee goals. So having clear goals for both the organization as well as for individual employees as human resources can find that goal congruence and can really help motivate our employees toward the achievement of the organization's mission. We know that our goals need to be clear. Clarification of goals is important because if we clarify our goals, that's how we can enhance the productivity and improve efficiency. However, if we have a set of goals that are unclear and people don't understand what those goals are, they can instead lead to frustration and can have the actual opposite impact of a clear goal. So know there are some good things about having goals in our organization. We can work toward that goal congruence. But we also know that the literature points out some problems that are associated with goals in organizations. One problem is this multiplicity of goals. And we've discussed this multiplicity of goals and multiplicity of values multiple times already in this class. We have multiple goals. Those multiple goals, we don't really know which goal is most important, which goal should we work toward. When you have multiplicity of goals, you oftentimes have conflict between those goals. So our goal of efficiency can certainly come into conflict with our goal for openness and transparency. The more open and transparent you are, obviously, the less efficient you'll probably be able to be. So our goals oftentimes are multiple and conflict. Our intermediate operative goals can also sometimes conflict with our official goals. So your short-term goals have the potential of conflicting with your long-term goals. And sometimes it's difficult for us to identify the linear model that we would look at in terms of which operative goals contribute to which official goals. You would like to think that you have a nice, clear, linear relationship where this operative goal leads to this operative goal, which leads to this operative goal, which eventually will then lead to our long-term official goal. Sometimes it's not that clear. You may have an operative goal that can contribute to several different goals. You may have an operative goal that you've never really crosswalked to the official goal. And so you may have some operative goals that don't really contribute to any of the long-term official goals of the organization. Sometimes it's difficult for us, for us to get agreement on what's an operative goal versus what is an official goal. What's a short-term goal versus what's the ultimate long-term goal of the organization. So clarity is obviously important with organizational goals. The problem, obviously, is that in the public sector, our goals are oftentimes relatively vague and intangible as compared to our private sector counterparts. And we've talked about this multiple times already this semester, so I think we all have a pretty good sense of this, but give me some reasons why public organization goals may be more vague and ambiguous and intangible than private sector goals.
Well, sometimes we're dealing with a lot more complexity, like more complex issues.
Yep, absolutely. There's more complexity in the public sector, and we have complexity that comes from a variety of different sources. We have complexity that comes from separation of powers. We have complexity that comes from our system of federalism, that vertical separation of power versus that horizontal separation of power. We know that we have a lot of different demands being placed upon organizations from a lot of different stakeholders, all with different vested interests. And so we've got a lot of complexity, and that complexity makes it more difficult for us to have these clear measurements for our goals in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Let me catch up with text chat here. So we have, and so Diana then says, public backlash. Obviously, we work in this fishbowl, and working in this fishbowl makes it more difficult for us to sometimes communicate the goals in a way in which you won't create some backlash from the public. And so sometimes you have to nuance the goals a little bit so everyone kind of understands and can get behind those goals. We're under constant scrutiny, that fishbowl effect, difficulty with measuring the success of the goals. We're not just running a profit. That's a relatively easy, quantifiable thing to measure. you're not doing that. Our goals tend to be a lot more qualitative, a little bit less empirical in nature than what we see in the private sector. Private has a specific set of audiences, while public needs to be fair and deal with different community members. Absolutely, you don't just have one group of consumers that you are appealing to. You have to work for everyone in society. So it's a much broader type of constituency, if you will. Allows flexibility for funding. That's a really great point from Diana, that the more specific the goals, sometimes the more restricted the funds to achieve those goals may be. And so if you've got some ambiguity and some vagueness built into your goals, then sometimes you're able to have a little bit more flexibility and have some more unrestricted funds, and you're able to spend the funds in a variety of different ways. I think that's a really good point. See, there's a focus on the budget for current year, so goals can be short term. Aaron says that's absolutely true. We're concerned about our appropriations. Excuse me, our appropriations at the federal level and in most states are annual appropriations. There are some states that do biennial budgeting, but the vast majority do annual budgeting, so they're annual appropriations. And so we kind of have that short-term focus on the appropriations for this year, and then same type of focus then for next year. And we sometimes really focus on those annual types of appropriations. Cesar, go ahead.
Oh, yes. Yeah, having worked many years in the private sector, many years in the same industry, but different companies, but in the private sector. And it's true that the private sector has more specific goals because it has a more specific audience. But believe me, I have also seen very wide, diffuse, and vague goals from some companies, kind of romanticized goals that at least in the company I have been, really nobody cares about, other than the bottom line goals, right? Which is performance. But yeah, they look nice. They look nice in the website. They look nice if you interview someone and you ask, what do you know about the company? And the interviewer, the interviewee will tell you what the goal of the company is about. So they look nice for that purpose, but they are very vague too. I have seen very vague goals in the private sector, even when the industry, when the private sector has more specific mission, right? And more specific shareholders. So, and it's true, there are specific ones to the point, but there are also a lot of, romanticized verbiage, mission and statements and goals and values that they looks very nice in the websites, right? But at the end of the day, stockholders and shareholders really care about the bottom line efficiency and production of the company.
Right. Yeah, and I agree. And that's a great point. There is variability. We like to, kind of in social sciences, classify things and make broad generalizations about things. And
yeah,
but there is a lot of variability. And as you're saying, you really have to look at organization culture. Different organizations have different cultures, and different organizations have different approaches to the articulation of their goals. And so it is possible you can have some private organizations that certainly have more vague goals in nature. And so you can have that variability in the private sector, much in the same way that you have it in the public sector. And I like Diana has a great point in text chat about, it adds a cushion. If you don't meet a goal, no one knows, and the department doesn't suffer, which is an excellent point. If you articulate a very specific goal, then you're going to be held accountable for achieving that goal. If you articulate a much more vague and ambiguous goal, it makes it more difficult to then hold that agency accountable for the achievement of that goal. And that becomes very important when you have things like performance activity reports, these PAR reports that are done at the federal level for federal agencies, where federal agencies on an annual basis are required to report their progress toward achievement of goals. And so if you've got a very specific goal, it's very easy to hold that agency accountable, and that agency may end up losing some of its appropriations in the next year as a punitive measure for not making progress toward its very specific goal. And I think that's an excellent point. So we do know that we do have this phenomenon of vague, ambiguous goals. And we know that vague, ambiguous goals can have some negative impacts upon employee motivation, employee commitment, and employee satisfaction. So I think all those comments about why we have vague goals in the public sector, I think they're all absolutely accurate. I think one other thing we want to look at is where the source of these goals come from. And so we have mandates coming out of a legislative body for these organizations. The mandates, the legislation that will come out of these legislative bodies, by definition, are going to be relatively vague and ambiguous themselves. And again, you're not going to be able to get agreement from the majority of 435 members of the House, or 100 members of the Senate, or 80 members of California Assembly, or 40 members of the California Senate, if you've got a very specific piece of legislation. So we tend to write legislation in a rather vague and ambiguous term, and then that relatively vague and ambiguous legislation then doesn't give a lot of guidance to agencies in terms of developing their own specific goals. So vague mandates and legislation will oftentimes lead to vague and ambiguous goals in organizations. The problem with goal ambiguity is, as we said, it makes it difficult for us to develop our performance indicators for how we are performing as an organization, excuse me, and the individual performance of our employees. It makes it difficult for us to hold people accountable, as Diana said, to hold the organization accountable for the achievement of its goals. It makes it difficult for us to have good formative performance evaluation processes, because we don't have clear indicators of performance. We're not going to be able to provide a lot of good, clear, formative feedback to our employees through the performance evaluation process. And the performance evaluation process in the organization is really, as we call it, the keystone of the entire human resource management function. That performance evaluation really holds all the other elements of the human resource management process together. And you pull that keystone out, you pull out performance evaluations, everything will then collapse upon itself. So there are some real important and real concerning implications if an organization does not do an adequate job of clearly articulating and identifying its goals. But identifying the goals of an organization that's extremely important for measuring the effectiveness of the organization. And as we will see with our next topic, talking about the 4 different models of effectiveness, the most common model of effectiveness is what we call the goal attainment model. And it's very simply this linear relationship between the actions of the organization and the ability of the organization to achieve its goals. We consider an organization to be effective if that organization has made progress toward or has achieved its goals. So obviously, if we have an organization that doesn't have goals to begin with, it's going to make it very difficult for us to measure the effectiveness of that organization. Now, fortunately for us, most organizations do articulate goals, but as was discussed before, and as Cesar has said, there's a lot of variability in terms of the specificity of the articulation of those goals. We also have to assume not only that an organization has goals, we have to assume that those goals are things that can be discovered. We can find out what those goals are for that organization. Again, fortunately, most goals of organizations are pretty discoverable. They're in our strategic planning process. They flow from our mission statements. And so if we've done a good job with strategic planning, our goals should be discoverable to those within the organization as well as outside of the organization. In the public sector, our goals are sometimes not as stable as we would like for them to be. You think about if you've got a change in administration, that political environment comes into play. And change in administrations will mean that perhaps our goals are going to change because our legislation mandates we're receiving from a legislative body are changing as well. So sometimes our goals are not quite as stable as we would like them to be, which is frustrating because we have a long-term goal. It may take you 5 years to achieve that goal, and then 3 years in, that goal changes. It's this moving target, and it can be very frustrating for organizations. What we've already talked about, it's difficult in the public sector to convert these abstract goals into specific objective measures because we don't have that bottom line that the private sector enjoys. We also have to assume that if we're going to use goals to measure the effectiveness of our organization, that we're able to collect data that's relevant to our goals, that we are able to collect it, we're able to process that data, and we're able to apply that data in a timely and appropriate manner. Basically, we're able to measure our progress toward our goals. I think in terms of organizations having goals and organizations making their goals relatively easy to discover, I think we tend to do pretty well on those counts. Where we have trouble in the public sector is converting abstract goals into specific objective measures, and then identifying and collecting and measuring and analyzing the relevant information that we need in order to track our progress toward the achievement of those goals. But obviously, if we're going to develop clear goals in an organization, we're going to probably do it through the strategic planning process. And I'm sure, again, a lot of you have been through a strategic planning process. So for those of you who have gone through strategic planning in your organization, can you share some of your experiences with the development of goals in strategic planning? Anyone want to share any experiences with strategic planning? I'll try and mute every time I cough, so try to keep up with my mute button. Anybody been through a strategic planning process and had any success or any frustrations with strategic planning? Let's see. Not high enough on the ladder to be involved. Department just told us what they were doing. That's one of the major problems of strategic planning, and that's an excellent point. Is that sometimes strategic planning is at the upper level of the organization, and it doesn't involve all the relevant stakeholders in the planning process. And so what that does is that causes a problem, because then these goals are established at the top of the organization without a lot of employee input, and therefore you then do not have a lot of employee buy-in, which makes the implementation of those goals very difficult. Heather, go ahead.
Yeah, when I was with a different organization, I actually asked for recommendations for consultants from colleagues of mine. I was the director, and the colleagues that I had said, don't get a consultant, do it from the inside. And I was a little bit hesitant to do it that way, but it actually worked out better. What we did was form the leadership team to start formulating the questions and kind of develop the structure of it. And then it was all staff driven. Staff went out into the community after deciding whether or not the questions that we had were valid and useful. And then they were the ones who went out and actually did the surveys. We had surveys online, we had surveys, written surveys that we took out in the community. And that then formed all of the strategic, the goals, and then the deliverables that we came back with from that. And that took out the whole "I was left out of it" portion of it. And so that made it a much more meaningful exercise. We didn't do it perfectly. There was a lot of things that in hindsight, everybody said, you know, well, if we could do it over again, we do this and that differently. But I think for our first go around, it was really a lot more, it got us thinking differently about a lot of things we did. So I was glad we did it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. And again, you're able to involve people in the process, and that's what's elemental to any good strategic planning process. So thank you for sharing. That's a great example. Diana, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. So within my organization, we have department goals, and within my group and my goal, our team's goal, right, our department's goal, we have metrics that we have to meet that align with our staffing all of our blood drives with volunteers, right? And so every year we have a volunteer needs assessment that correlates with our demand and the metrics that we need to meet. So we have 200 shifts, so we'll only ask for 190 volunteers, because sometimes they take more than one shift, right? So you're overcompensating, and there's an entire formula that we turn in every quarter and then every year. The only problem is with assessing and giving an exact number, you're working with other departments, and so we work specifically with our recruitment department. So if they're unable to do their portion of the job, then our metrics suffer, because, for example, I'm at a need of 200 volunteers every month, but I'm working with 133 at the current standing of how many volunteers they were able to recruit. So it works effectively in letting other departments know, hey, this is what we need from you, but then it falls short if other departments aren't providing or performing at the caliber that they need to.
Right. Good, great point. Yeah, you need all the departments contributing. If you have even one department that doesn't contribute adequately, then you're not going to be able to achieve the goals. And that's an excellent example. Natasha, go ahead.
I'm not sure if it's the same thing, but our director recently sent out an email sharing how we are now doing half-day meetings where everyone is involved to define our mission, objectives, and values. And I was really caught off guard because this is only a job I'm trying to just get me through grad school, but it's just really interesting that the whole, like, all the staff are being called in for half days at 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. starting this week at one Wednesday. So they're going to be monthly events, monthly meetings. And I mean, I think it's great that they're getting everyone involved, but I'm just really taken aback because I guess there's a lot of discontent and a lot of, I don't know, a lot of things that people are not pleased with. So I'm glad for it, but also I'm like, I don't really want to be involved here.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's great, but
Yep. Yeah, and that's another important point is it's kind of a shock to a lot of a shock to the system, and sometimes you need to gradually implement these and kind of show how this is going to be beneficial. If it's something that's brand new, then there is going to be some resistance to coming in and doing this. And I think the bigger the change, the more resistance that there could be. And I think again that's a really good important point. Kyle, I see have your hand up.
Yeah, so I participated in a strategic planning process in the last couple of years with our city council, and the strategy that was taken with the team to develop essentially the strategic planning goals was to talk to them about the things that the council wanted, the things that they wanted to see, and then to kind of have that evolve into a list. So we have a list on every council report now that says how this council report connects back to the strategic planning goals that they set up, things like maintaining quality of life and transparency and promoting a strong economic base, those kinds of things. So every report we have now has those strategic plans, how it's connected, and sometimes it's connected multiple ways. But from that, we also use that list to create a work plan, and that work plan is constantly put in front of the council's face as, okay, you want us to do that, which of these things don't you want us to do? Because the staffing level you have, you can't expect all of these things to be done. So it actually helps our meetings run a lot more efficiently because council doesn't have, they stay away from essentially creating work from the dais because they have this very specific process that they've agreed to live in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great process. And again, what you're doing is you're integrating those goals into the everyday work processes, and it does kind of put some guardrails on city council and those elected officials. And it also helps us to articulate how everything that we are doing relates back to certain goals in our strategic plan. When I was on school board, we had a similar thing. Obviously, in California in education, it's a little bit easier to do it because school districts have these things called the LCAPs that they have to put together, where they have to list their goals and then the actions that they're going to be taking and the amount of money they're spending on each one of those actions. It's kind of like a robust performance budgeting type of process that's required of school districts. And so then what you could then do is then take on your agenda, every action item links back then to one of those goals from the LCAP. And that's what's important, is if you can link what you're doing back to those goals, that's how you get that clarity in the goals in the strategic plan. That's how you make your strategic plan really a living, breathing type of document. The old adage in strategic planning is if you're always planning, you are never doing. And that's what a lot of organizations end up falling prey to, is that they will have their nice retreats and their nice getaways to do their strategic planning, and they'll put together some goals and some objectives. They'll put together work groups and action plans, and then they'll go back to work, and then the normal everyday work gets in the way. And then they never actually put these action plans into effect. And then a year or two later, they get back together again and they do some more strategic planning and revise their goals, and then don't implement them again. And so you're always planning and you're never doing. But the example that you gave, Kyle, is a great example of how you're actually doing it. You're holding everyone accountable so that their actions are tied to those goals that we're articulating in the strategic planning process. I know we've got some comments in text chat, so let's see. Changes greatly with directors, no continuity between leaders. Again, that's something endemic to the public sector, and every time you have a change in leadership, that could certainly have a profound impact upon the goals that you're achieving, and that new leaders can bring in excuse me, a new orientation toward different types of goals. Since I've been in project management and planning in the past, and the problem was miscommunication across departments. Communication is obviously imperative to strategic planning. And the more individuals you have involved, the more units you have involved, the more the likelihood for some miscommunication. That kind of takes us back to Mary Parker Follett and her emphasis on participation. And we love the emphasis on participation. We love a democratic organization, but we also have to realize that there are some limitations, that the more cooks you get in the kitchen, the more likelihood there is for some miscommunication. Let's see, my organization developed a database, however, did not get feedback from the actual users, rather from leadership. Didn't use the database. Yeah, if you don't talk to the people who are actually going to be doing this on a daily basis and actually get the input from those individuals, obviously it's not going to be a very effective strategic planning process. And let's see, I was involved and had to do a lot of brainstorming sessions, but then very few of our mid-level input made it to the strategic plan in the end. That's kind of another excellent point, because that's kind of the difference between consultation and participation. Consultation is an approach to leadership where you consult, you allow people to participate, but then they don't really have the resources to implement any decisions that they make. And those decisions that they make in consultation are then done away with by upper level management. So instead of consultation, you really want to have participation, whereby you're devolving resources throughout the entire organization. There's this difference between decentralization and devolution. So decentralization is allowing actors to be involved in the decision-making process. That's one thing. You're giving people a seat at the decision-making table, which is important, but unless you then go the next step with devolution and actually devolve power and resources to those individuals and to those departments who actually carry out the decisions that they are making, that decentralization is going to be just kind of lip service. So you need to have both decentralization of decision-making as well as devolution of true decision-making authority and true decision-making power and resources. But again, I think, the moral of the story here is that it really depends. Like everything else I like to talk about, it depends. It depends upon the organization, depends upon the recency of leadership in the organization, depends upon the culture of the organization. If there's already a good horizontal and vertical communication system in the organization, if you don't have that horizontal or vertical communication in the organization, you're going to have to create that. And creating that is a gradual process. It takes time, takes a lot of trust. You're not going to just be able to jump right into strategic planning. Strategic planning requires effort on the part of everyone in the organization. And if you're asking people to put forth effort, but they don't really see any benefit that will accrue by putting forth this effort, then obviously they're going to be resistant to put forth that effort. I've got my own things I have to do. I have my own job that I'm being evaluated on. So I need to do the types of things that will get me a good performance evaluation for my future in the organization. And if you're adding on just additional tasks that I need to do, obviously that's going to get in the way of a good performance evaluation. So it's a process, and it's a difficult process, and a lot of organizations are not terribly good at the strategic planning process. At my university, we're kind of dealing with that issue right now. We have a strategic planning process called Beach 2030. And so the strategic plan looks forward to 2030, and there are some goals that have been articulated in terms of size of enrollment and orientation of certain types of programs and the role of the university and the community and all those good types of things. And so the problem is that those goals are essentially established at the upper level of the university, and then the process goes down to the departments, and then departments then put together their goals, but their goals have to fit within the university's goals, and their goals then have to fit within the college's goals, and the college's goals have to fit within the academic affairs goals, and academic affairs goals then have to fit within the university president's goals. And so oftentimes in strategic planning, we say we're involving everyone, but we're not really giving them a lot of power. We're not really devolving a lot of power to them in the strategic planning process. Unfortunately, a lot of strategic planning is done for just to look good in the organization. And it's not really done for the true goal of articulating clear goals and clear objectives that will help the organization become more effective. It's kind of hard to talk about the steps in strategic planning because strategic planning is going to differ depending upon the environment. And so different organizations will certainly deal with it differently. But as several people have already pointed out, one of your first steps is some type of a needs analysis, some type of a needs assessment, both within the organization as well as a needs assessment for the external environment. You don't know what you need to, you don't know what you should accomplish unless you know what needs you're trying to fulfill, both in the organization as well as in the environment. You certainly need to define a good agency mission. Now today, for MPA programs, we are required that everything we do is mission driven. So whether it be the curriculum that you offer, whether it be the pedagogical approaches that you offer, whether it be the modalities that you offer, whether it be the resources that you are generating and relying upon, everything that the program does needs to be tied back to that program's mission. And so the mission really is that guiding light for everything that we're going to do in the establishment of our goals and our objectives. You articulate and communicate the vision. So we need to have a good vision of the organization. Where does the organization see itself in its environment? Where does the organization see itself in its environment in the future? I think Charlie says very little collaboration is what I'm experiencing in the public sector. Decisions are made after the fact. Collaboration input is requested when at the point the contribution seems pointless. Yeah, if you don't have the contributions early on, you're not asking this early on, obviously it does seem to be somewhat pointless. Charlie, go ahead.
First of all, I apologize. I am late. For some reason, my clock switched an hour back, and so I'm obviously not on time. So my apologies. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I had to make a huge shift in my paper and in the assignments that we've had simply because a situation came up in my organization where we're losing our in-house graphic designer. And for the duration of the last 1.5 years, economic development's been overseeing marketing, communications, and branding, which I know they play an important role in promoting the destination. But the challenge that I'm having is that the individual that this person reports to has absolutely no experience in marketing, communications, or anything to that realm. And so what's happening is that there's a disconnect between that individual and the boss. And what's happening is there's a lot of turnover because we speak two different languages. And so now the challenge that I'm having is I was brought on board not just as the assistant to the city manager, but also to oversee the communications efforts because of my background in destination marketing. And I'm just getting so much of this resistance because we've always done it that way. We're different from the private sector. And it's almost like I want to beat my head up against the wall. And it's become such a challenge that my focus has been so much this that I've gotten this close to being like, maybe this is just not the right fit for me, because even though the city manager says, I brought you on board for this purpose, I have individuals that have been here for a long time. Collaboration seems to be like an afterthought, where it's like, this is the decision. And what are your thoughts?
Yep, very true. And again, if people are not involved all the way through the process, it is absolutely frustrating. And actually, I had a thought that really dovetailed well with what you're saying. I just lost it, so I'm gonna say it's the brain fog, my cold that's doing it. But I think you're absolutely right on it. You need to have people involved in the process, early on. And the more you have, changes in the organization, the more difficult it is. Oh, and what I was going to point out is this goes back to organization culture. This goes back to changing the culture. It's one of the most frustrating things is what you said is when people said, well, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. That is so frustrating. Yes, we've always done it that way, but maybe we've always been committing errors when we've been doing it this way. And so just by saying, but we've always done it this way, means that you're resistant to changing the culture. And that's problematic in organizations. I think you're right. That happens a lot in the public sector. Well, this is, when I came in, this is how we did it. And we've always done it this way. But it's not a good enough excuse to continue doing it in that manner. So,
And you have city council, right? You have the mayor. And so it's like all of these great ideas come together, city manager, everybody else on board. And then you have this whole other component that I'm not used to, which is now they have to buy into it.
mhm.
And if they don't buy into it, all the work that I've done is like out the door.
Right. Yeah, and that's frustrating. I know, when I was an elected official, I tried to be really understanding of the fact that, as a school board member, I'm coming in every other Tuesday for board meetings, but I'm not in the everyday management of the organization. And so my job is to be a resource to help the management of the organization rather than being resistant to the management of the organization. And unfortunately, some of my colleagues didn't feel the same way. And it's frustrating because a lot of elected officials have a different motivation than administrators have. If we're elected officials, their motivation is to try and get reelected for the most part. And obviously that's going to lead them to different behaviors and actions than an administrator who's looking at good policy and looking at effective and efficient administration of the organization. And again, that's kind of that publicness of public administration. So excellent points. So as you go through this process, it's going to differ, but obviously one of the main points in strategic planning is the establishment of goals and objectives. And that's what we're really focused on here tonight is how can we establish clear goals that will then help us to be more effective and more efficient as an organization. If we develop clear goals, obviously then we're going to be able to develop some performance measures that we can then apply to the performance of not only individual employees, but the organization as a whole. We need to have a vertical and horizontal system of communication so we can communicate those measures, develop action plans for specifically how are we going to achieve these goals and these objectives, and then articulate, communicate those action plans, and then most importantly, actually implement those action plans, which is something we oftentimes don't get around to doing in organizations. There's one of the major differences between public and private sector organizations is oftentimes in the public sector, we have a lot of these fire drills. We have a lot of these crises that pop up that will take our focus away from what we are trying to accomplish. And so sometimes we don't get around to actually implementing those action plans. We need to make sure that we have conformity in that the goals and the objectives at the program level fit into the goals and objectives at the departmental level, which fit into the goals and objectives of the organization as a whole. That's that crosswalking process where we crosswalk our activities and our goals to make sure everything is working together to achieve our organizational goals. We need to be able to do a good job of identifying the resources that are necessary for the achievement of these goals. It's one thing to say this is the goal that we are trying to achieve. It's another thing to actually put the money behind the achievement of that goal. And oftentimes our resources end up going elsewhere for more immediate concerns, and we don't really adequately support and fund our strategic plans. We get feedback from all elements of the organization. We roll the plan up to upper level of management. Plan gets approved at upper level, and then we go through the implementation of that plan and put in place a tracking mechanism so we can track our progress toward the goals that we've identified in our strategic plan. But again, to do a good job of strategic planning, you need to really have a culture that is supportive of the strategic planning process. You need decentralization and you need devolution of resources and devolution of power. And oftentimes we do strategic planning for lip service in organizations rather than doing it for any practical, pragmatic type of result. But the big part that we get out of strategic planning is we hopefully will end up with our mission statement, a clear mission statement, and we'll end up with the goals that we are trying to achieve as an organization. Again, these goals are certainly going to differ depending upon organization and organizational culture. So what I'd like for us to do is to, using our organizations as the basis, break up into groups and then have each group identify 2 examples of goals from your organizations and then how these goals affect effectiveness. either how they contribute to effectiveness or how they are difficult to achieve and how they can sometimes stand in the way of effectiveness. So yeah, so you're going to be considering the goals of your organization. As a group, come up with 2 examples, of goals, and doesn't have to be 2 examples from everybody's organization. Just has to be 2 examples overall from the combined discussion of your organizations. 2 examples of goals, and then how those goals can affect the achievement of effectiveness as the organization. If you've got a very clear goal, is it something that's very easy to achieve, something that's very easy to measure, or is the goal more difficult to achieve, more intangible, and so therefore much more difficult to measure the effectiveness of the organization? Okay, make sense? Sound good? Okay, let me go to the breakout rooms, and let's see. Sorry, we have 30, so let's go. We'll say we'll go with 5 breakout rooms again. So let me go ahead and create them. Okay, I've created the room, so I'll go ahead and open them up, and let's see, it's 6:50. Let's say we'll spend about 30 minutes on this, and then we'll reconvene as a class at 7:20. We'll see what you came up with, and then we'll probably call it an early night. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the room so you can work on it for about 30 minutes, and we'll see what you come up with. Okay, the rooms are open. Yeah, I think almost everyone should be back by now. Let's see. Yep, all the rooms closed up, so we are all back. All right, let's see what you came up with. So we'll start as always with room number 1.
I think that's us. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Yeah, that's us.
Great.
Okay, great.
We were discussing the Minneapolis Police Department and discussing their current mission, which interestingly is really long. We were expecting, a few sentences, and the first part of their mission gives an incredible amount of detail in almost like what an officer is doing every shift. And then this is from their manual. Their manual then goes into 2 primary goals of public safety and justice. And we were talking about how tricky that is with effectiveness, that perhaps the mission, the goal of the mission being so detailed was transparency in this time where that's a big issue. But then looking at the goals of public safety and justice, those feel like such big words, big concepts, and hard to know, what that means. And they don't go into what that means. So that's pretty much what we came to.
Good, and I agree. So some organizations they fall into the trap of trying to put everything into their mission statement, and the more you put in the mission statement, just the muddier it gets. But I think you're right. Maybe they have such a long mission statement because of everything that happened and trying to be as transparent and open as possible. But you're right. Public safety and justice, very broad goals. I mean, it's very difficult to measure those. Those would really need to be broken down into some measurable components. I think that's a good example of having vague and ambiguous goals that then make it difficult to use those goals to then motivate employees. So I think that's a great example of goals that are a little bit too vague and too ambiguous. Okay, good.
But it also had report writing as one of their goals, which is just like seems so doesn't belong in a mission statement.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
it's just a really long list of tasks, basically.
Yeah, I think they probably need some help of what a mission statement is and how to write a mission statement. Because I mean, that sounds like a report writing. That sounds more like a function that you would find on a position description that you would then allocate a percentage of time for that position to report writing rather than putting in a mission statement.
That's exactly how that feels. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, good. That's a good example kind of that how not to do a mission statement. So excellent. Thank you. How about room number 2? Sorry.
that us, guys?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I just clicked join. So for our group, we've noticed that it starts from vague, such as providing excellent service, who Erin and Thomas mentioned, to for my job, creating programs to enrich the community, which again, they're very vague. It's not so much like ways to capture or to really measure anything, but we do notice it's because we work in more the public sector. To specific, where Cesar was sharing, it's a collaborative environment where everyone is encouraged to work with everybody. But in terms of affecting employee and performance and effectiveness, overall, it really depends on the individual. Although Anna mentioned that her work uses standardized employee evaluations, it actually doesn't reflect the efforts of an employee. And from my experience, like it really does depend on the employee, because we do have a silo mentality. So for example, if someone asks my coworker a question, they might not know the answer, but if they ask me, maybe I do know the answer. So it just, the effectiveness again depends on, you know, who is working that day and who actually knows anything. But yeah.
Yeah, and then that's certainly what happens in those silo types of organizations, is that you have, you know, very specific areas of knowledge within those silos, but you don't really have any cross functionality. And you know, that's one of the ways to get away from silo organizations, is through cross functional training. And cross functional training is very useful, but it's done less in the public sector than it is in the private sector. And one of the reasons why it's done less in the public sector is because of position classifications, position descriptions. So if you're going to try and do some cross-functional training, and you're going to have people do other people's jobs, that kind of a cross-functional approach, you're going to have people who are working outside their description. And if they're working outside their description, then that's grounds for a grievance if they're unionized employees. And then, you know, it's a slippery slope from there on in. And so a lot of the position classification and the unionization makes that cross-functional training somewhat difficult in the public sector. But that's the best way to get around a siloed organization, is with cross-functionality. So, good. Okay. Thank you very much. And room number 3.
Hi, evening, everyone. So to the shock and surprise of group number 3, I actually shared with my teammates that in my particular office, we don't have a mission statement and we don't have goals actually written out and listed. So that was a big surprise to myself and to everyone else in my team. So if I look further or higher up in other committees that oversee our work, they do have mission statements, but our particular office doesn't have one. And so I wanted to share ours from the committee that oversees our work, which is our mission is to bolster the accountability and transparency of government performance in defined policy areas. Pretty general, pretty short, pretty vague. So it's kind of a surprise, or it's no surprise that we don't have a clear direction in our goals for our particular office. But contrary to us, Tim actually in our group was going to highlight a better job.
My organization, we do our goals by the different departments. So I looked up my department's goal and remembered what we wrote for this year. And it felt like the perfect example of a vague goal. Like, it's kind of like, you can, based off what this goal is, you can do whatever you want to reach it. But one of the things that my organization does to make sure that we're on track with even these vague goals is that we have to not only establish a goal, we have to establish our strategy of how we're going to achieve that goal. We then have to establish what we want the outcome of that goal and strategy to be. And we have to share how we are going to measure or assess the effectiveness of that goal, or how well or not well did we achieve the goal. So even though the goal itself is super vague, we have to document much more detail to be clear on what we plan on doing and how we are going to measure that at the end of the year.
Great. And I think that's a really important point, Tim, is that, you know, the goal may be vague, but you have these measures in place for how you will, you know, like you said, you know, how you will measure it, the strategies that will be put in place in order to achieve the goal, and the outcome. And that's an important part of it, is that the outcome, the consequences of achieving that goal is something that organizations have to look at as well. So, what are the outcomes? What are the consequences for people who come into contact with our organization? If we are successful doing this, what are the consequences for those citizens and those quote unquote consumers? And so you can have a goal that's relatively vague, but if you have some really well articulated performance measures and strategies, I think that can certainly help the organization, help motivate employees even with a vague goal. And in terms of the first example from the organization, in the mission statement, in defined policy areas, that's kind of interesting. They say in defined policy areas, unless there are a whole lot of policy areas, you would think in the mission, those defined policy areas would probably be defined in the mission. So unless you're talking about dozens and dozens of policy areas, rather than defined policy areas, it seems like they would actually define what those areas are actually in the mission statement itself. So that kind of struck me as interesting. They say define policy areas, but then don't define them. So, okay, great. Thank you both. Very well done. Group number 4.
Hi, everyone. So for our group, myself and Caesar were from the private sector. Everybody else was from the public. And we chose to go with the 2 goals that I presented. The first one was, I work in shipping first and foremost. So it is a private company. It's in Long Beach. And it's one of a group of terminals that is in Long Beach. And the first goal is we have specific goals as far as move counts for specific vessels, right? So that is a goal that we set like every week. I mean, you have monthly goals as well and also yearly, but it's cascaded down even further down to daily, hourly, per shift, and that helps to gauge performance and effectiveness of different managers on different shifts, weekly performance for different staff members and all that. So that pretty much helps, and it's very defined and it's easily tracked. The other one was, I don't know if you guys have heard about the Net Promoter Score. So it's those little signatures that you see in the bottom of emails with the happy face or the sad face. And it's scaled, and it's like an internationally used tracking tool to see customer service. And then when you talk about effectiveness or performance for different employees, then you would have, based on the responses that the customers have for different sections of the organization or different people that receive certain types of reviews, then you're able to track their performance or their effectiveness. And then that is also used for things like bonuses or, kudos and stuff like that. So it's subjective, but it still helps to gauge in a sense. Most private companies use it. And if you have a score, say over 60, that's very good. So it's a little bit better than like Google reviews that people, place on Google. But that was the 2 for our group.
Okay, great. And that's a great example of quantitative types of measures. I mean, they're very empirical, very quantitative. The move counts, like you said, you can do those move counts all the way down to, daily and hourly and by shift. And what that then allows you to do is it allows you to have those empirical measures that you can then build in to the job description itself, the position description. You can use something like a results-oriented description, where you could specifically in that results-oriented description say, here is the expectation of move count, on an hourly basis for a person in this position. And the nice thing about that, obviously, is it's a very empirical performance measure. Going into the job, the person knows what move count they are accountable for, what standard they have to hit. And then if they don't hit that standard, then they're not surprised when they get some negative feedback in their formative appraisal. So that's a great example of oftentimes what we're not able to do with pure public goods, but you can certainly do in this type of an organization. So excellent. Very good. Thank you. And room number 5.
Yes, for group 5, I work at a health insurance company, and we mostly serve people that have Medi-Cal. And our mission statement is to provide access to quality care, which I think is awesome, especially when you are a Medi-Cal recipient. Except that right now it's leading to a lot of hand holding, where our customer service representatives are getting a lot of calls. And because we strive to provide access to care, we help them make the appointments and help them get those referrals. But it's resulting in them depending too much on the customer service agent compared to them themselves advocating. So right now we're working on maybe creating some newsletters of some sort to teach our members how to advocate for themselves, but also always know that we're there for them and we can help them out, especially as a Medi-Cal recipient. Sometimes our members feel that because they have Medi-Cal, maybe they're looked down upon. And it's also a provider issue. As much as I want to say, oh, a provider would never treat a Medi-Cal recipient different than someone who has private insurance. At the end of the day, they do, because it's a business, it's a payment thing. But we strive, at least where I work, to provide that access to quality care for our Medi-Cal recipients.
Good, and a really interesting thing there in terms of trying to measure performance among employees is that, normally you would think that you could measure performance based upon, client satisfaction. But what you're mentioning is that you don't want you want clients to become advocates for themselves.
Yeah.
And so if you provide too many services or do too much hand holding, you might get a good customer service review, but you're not benefiting the client because they're not really learning how to advocate for themselves. And so it makes it more difficult to measure performance. How do you measure how well an employee has helped someone become their own advocate? That's a much more difficult measurement than just how satisfied they were with the service they received from the employee. So that's a great point. That again illustrates how sometimes in the public sector it becomes a lot more difficult with a lot of these types of services to actually have that empirical measurement because they're much more nuanced and much more detailed. Okay,
Yes.
That's a great example. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Perfect. Well done. Again, I like the fact that we have some representation from public organizations and from private organizations because it gives us that nice comparison. Sometimes just how different it is in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And it's true that both public and private organizations need to have goals. They need to have clear goals, but they also then need to have measurement standards and measurement indicators and strategies in place for measuring the achievement of those goals. Just sometimes it's a little bit easier in the private sector than it may be in the public sector. So I think that's kind of our takeaway from this. But the important thing about this discussion of goals and effectiveness is it really segues very nicely into our next topic, which we're not going to do tonight, but our next topic, which we're going to do next week, which is a discussion of the different models or ways that we can measure organizational effectiveness, because that first model is the goal attainment model. And that's whenever we think about effectiveness, we typically think about effectiveness in terms of how well the organization is achieving its goals or how much progress is the organization making toward the achievement of its goals. But as we'll talk about next week, that's only one model for measuring effectiveness. We'll also present a second model called the systems resource model. We'll also present a third model called the participant satisfaction model, and we'll present another model called the internal process model. And we'll look at those four models next week, all as discrete ways of measuring the effectiveness of the organization. And then we'll look at our organizations and see which of those models we tend to see used most often within our organizations. So this is like a nice segue then into our topic for next week, our four models of organizational effectiveness. We'll leave it at that for tonight. Again, remember you have your next Canvas essay and then the alternative solutions paper coming due on Sunday. As you work on your alternative solutions paper, if you have any questions at all, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, it's due on Sunday, and then we'll be back at it with the four models of effectiveness next Monday. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and thank you very much. I'll work on being on the mend for next Monday. So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Feel better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Sorry I was late.
Take care.
Dr. Powell, can I talk to you after class?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Let's see. Okay. close this up. Okay, I think, am I still muted? No, I
No.
think I'm unmuted. Okay, sure.
Yes.
What's up?
Yes. I just had a quick question. I just wanted to make sure, because I know you typically don't accept late work, but I just wanted to ask just in case. Because I haven't seen you grade my week 3. I didn't get a chance to finish the essay for that week. Is there an opportunity to still submit it and get partial credit or to do something else? I just had a lot going on that weekend, so
Sure.
I chose to do the background paper instead of
Yeah.
doing the essay. Yeah.
Yeah, no problems. Yeah, you can still submit it, and it'll be for full credit. So go ahead and submit it. And
Okay.
No worries. Yeah, I understand things like that happen. So absolutely, you can still submit.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day.
Have a great evening.
Take care.